It's just awful what all that's happened to this little town. Nobody needed to die like that.
It scared the town real bad because they didn't know what happened.
Absolutely nobody deserves to die like that. And yet, the G family did. On a calm September night in 2009, a family of 6 went to bed believing they'd wake to another ordinary morning. But instead of sunrise, horror came knocking. A man with pure evil in his heart broke into their home, turning their quiet farmhouse into a scene of unspeakable carnage. Even the most experienced investigators were shaken by what they found. A crime so brutal, so senseless, it would forever be remembered as the Bloodbath in Beason. And once you hear what really happened inside that house, you'll understand why this tragedy still haunts the town to this day. For starters, this case brings us to Beason, a small, quiet town about 200 miles southwest of Chicago, tucked deep in the farmlands of Illinois. Only around 200 people live there, and most of them have known each other their whole lives. And at the center of our story are 2 families, the G family and the Constant family, both of whom called Beason their home in the late 1990s. Rick G was one of those men everyone respected. He was known for being reliable, hands-on, and tough as nails when it came to work. In his early days, he worked for his stepdad's construction company in Lincoln, the nearest big town, about 10 miles away. Lincoln had everything Beason didn't: schools, grocery stores, fast food, a Walmart, even a small regional airport. For small-town folks, Lincoln was where you ran your errands, grabbed supplies, or took your kids for a weekend treat. Rick's mom, Judy, and his stepdad, known by everyone as Pudge, also lived in Lincoln. Rick learned a lot from them, especially Pudge, who taught him the ins and outs of construction work. Over time, Rick earned a reputation as someone who didn't cut corners. Now it's important to note that before everything that happened in Beason, Rick G already had a daughter from his first marriage back in 1988. Her name was Nicole G. There isn't much public information about how Rick met his first wife or what led to their separation, but what's clear is that Rick stayed a devoted father. He worked hard to give Nicole a stable life and a future he could be proud of. And after years of saving every dollar he could, Rick finally managed to buy a piece of land on the outskirts of Beason. It was a dream he had built from the ground up. Instead of staying with his stepfather Pudge's construction company, Rick took a leap of faith and started his own business, and he called it the G Construction. He poured his heart into building a home there, a ranch-style house with a detached 2-car garage, an above-ground pool for Nicole, and wide stretches of land where he could raise chickens and small farm animals. But let's be real, owning a home and running a business in a small town wasn't easy. To help with expenses, Rick decided to rent out one of his rooms. That decision would change everything, because that's when Ruth Constant entered the picture. Ruth was a single mother of 2 young children, 3-year-old Justina and 1-year-old Dylan. She was strong, funny, and had the kind of personality that instantly drew people in. When she moved in as Rick's tenant, they hit it off almost immediately. Their friendship soon turned into something deeper. Before long, Ruth and Rick were inseparable, and in 1997, they got married. Rick was 34, Ruth 27, and not long after they welcomed a son, Austin. Their family grew again the following year when Ruth gave birth to a baby girl, Jessica. For a while, it seemed like everything was falling into place: a cozy home, happy kids, and a small but thriving family business. But things took a heartbreaking turn when baby Jessica was diagnosed with a severe neurological condition that required constant medical attention. Beason didn't have the kind of care facilities she needed, and the nearest specialized hospital was miles away. The financial strain and emotional toll were immense. With heavy hearts, Rick and Ruth made the agonizing decision to place Jessica under state care in Peoria, about 50 miles from Beason. Sadly, Jessica passed away sometime before the events of this case. Her loss deeply affected the family, but they did what most parents do. They kept going for the sake of their other children. Rick threw himself into work. Ruth focused on keeping the household running, and together they tried to find happiness again in their quiet corner of Illinois. But as we all know, no family is ever perfect. Over time, Ruth's son, Dylan, started showing behavioral issues. He was an energetic, restless boy, always moving, talking, and sometimes acting out. His teachers often sent home notes about his behavior, and while it was typical for kids his age, it started to worry the family. Rick and Ruth didn't ignore it. They sought help, and after several sessions, Dylan was diagnosed with ADHD. Therapy helped a little, but it didn't completely change things. Still, the family stayed hopeful and supportive, doing their best to manage things together. Amid all the challenges, life had its bright moments too. Rick's oldest daughter, Nicole, from his first marriage, had just turned 18. Around that time, she started dating 21-year-old Christopher Harris, a local from the area. Their relationship got serious quickly, and before long, the two got married and moved into a house just a minute away from Rick's home in Beason. Not long after, Nicole gave birth to a baby girl, Elisa Harris. Rick and Ruth were overjoyed to become grandparents for the first time. Nicole and Chris often dropped off little Elisa at the G home while they went to work, and Ruth absolutely loved babysitting her. Then, in late July of 2009, Nicole and Chris welcomed their second baby. By all accounts, life seemed peaceful again. The family was close, happy, and surrounded by love. That September, Rick's stepdad Pudge and his grandson Adam visited Nicole and Chris to help install new carpet in their home. It was supposed to be just another family project, nothing out of the ordinary. But the next morning, everything changed. 10-year-old Seton Landstrom, a neighbor and family friend, rode his bike over to the G house, excited to show off his new ride. But when he reached the porch, he froze. There was blood smeared across the door and steps, and the front door was slightly open. Panicked, he rushed straight to Nicole's house nearby, where Pudge and Adam were staying. The moment they heard what Seton said, Pudge and Adam raced to the G home. Adam got there first and immediately spotted a large knife at the bottom of the porch steps, and blood everywhere. As he stepped inside and flipped on the light, he stopped dead in his tracks. Lying face down in the hallway was Rick G., surrounded by a thick pool of blood. The sight was beyond anything Adam had ever imagined. Frozen in shock, he ran back outside and told Pudge to call 911, struggling to find the right words to describe what he'd just seen. When police arrived minutes later, they were met with a scene of absolute horror. Blood covered the floor, walls, and even parts of the ceiling. Rick's head and upper body were destroyed beyond recognition, and the sheer amount of blood suggested a shotgun had been used. But that was only the beginning. When they entered 16-year-old Justina's room, they were met with a sight so horrific that some investigators later said it was the worst crime scene they'd ever witnessed. Blood covered nearly every surface. Justina lay on her bed, face down, her head hanging off the edge, and a pool of brain matter beneath her. She had suffered the most severe injuries of all. But the nightmare still wasn't over. As officers checked the rest of the house, they spotted something small in a nearby closet, what looked like a child's body. When they opened the door, they found a 3-year-old girl crumpled on the floor, barely recognizable and surrounded by blood. Her skin had been peeled back above her right ear. Then suddenly, one of the paramedics noticed movement. The little girl was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. The paramedic scooped her up and sprinted to the ambulance while others shouted for help. Moments later, Nicole arrived, completely distraught. Both she and the surviving child, later identified as Tabitha, were rushed to the nearest hospital. But when they arrived, doctors realized just how bad it was. Tabitha's injuries were critical, and her vital signs were dropping fast. Moments later, Nicole's husband, Chris Harris, arrived at the G house after getting an urgent call while at work. When he pulled up, the street was filled with flashing lights and chaos. squad cars, ambulances, and terrified neighbors gathered in disbelief. Police quickly confirmed the heartbreaking truth. Rick, Ruth, and their children were all dead. The entire G family had been murdered. But amid the horror, there was one small piece of hope. Officers told Chris that 3-year-old Tabitha had survived the attack. Everyone around him felt a wave of relief. Maybe, just maybe, she could help identify who did this. But Chris didn't look relieved. Witnesses later recalled that his reaction was strange. He seemed tense, nervous, almost panicked upon hearing that Tabitha was still alive. Without wasting a second, Chris jumped back into his truck and sped off toward the hospital where Tabitha was being treated. At the same time, first responders, Logan County Sheriff's Corporal Michael Block and Illinois State Trooper Paul Hennessy, stayed behind to begin the grim task of combing through the crime scene for clues. Inside the house, investigators found evidence everywhere. A bloody handprint was discovered on the bathroom vanity near where Austin's body had been found. Outside, they spotted a distinct shoe print in the dirt. It matched a K-Swiss tennis shoe. Detectives went door to door across the tiny community, asking neighbors if they'd seen anything suspicious. One neighbor mentioned seeing a silver pickup truck driving by around the time of the murders. It had large exhaust pipes sticking straight up through the truck bed behind the cab. But beyond that, there wasn't much else to go on. Beason was small and quiet. Nothing like this had ever happened there before. Later that evening, Dr. John Ralston, a forensic pathologist, performed the autopsies. It was a brutal task. Each body was carefully photographed and examined, but the injuries were so extensive it was hard to count them all. One thing quickly became clear. The family hadn't been shot, as first suspected. They'd been beaten to death, one by one. Rick G. had 39 separate impact wounds, 13 of them to his head. His wife Ruth suffered 28 blows. Her skull was completely crushed. Their 11-year-old son Austin was struck at least 21 times. His skull had caved in, and there were marks showing he had been shoved against hard surfaces, even stomped on. 14-year-old Dylan endured over 100 wounds, including 52 severe head strikes, the most of anyone. 16-year-old Justina's injuries were so violent that the top of her skull was missing. Each family member had clearly fought hard for their lives, but the attacker showed no mercy. Meanwhile, at the trauma center, doctors were fighting to keep little Tabitha alive. She had multiple skull fractures, severe brain swelling, and massive bruising to her face. Her tiny body had taken a horrific beating. She couldn't speak or open her eyes. Her face was too swollen. But to everyone's relief, she could still move one of her arms, a faint sign that she still had strength left. The medical team made a bold, life-saving decision. They performed a surgery to remove small portions of her skull, easing the pressure on her brain to prevent further damage. It was a risky procedure, but it was her best chance. Against all odds, Tabitha was still hanging on, fragile, silent, but alive, the only living witness to one of Illinois' darkest crimes. Throughout this devastating tragedy, Nicole, the oldest daughter of the G family, became the emotional anchor for what little remained of her shattered world. While investigators pieced together the horror that unfolded in Beason, she stayed at the hospital, refusing to leave Tabitha's side. The little girl was hooked up to machines, fighting for her life, and Nicole made sure she was never alone. Police officers stood guard near the door, their presence constant and heavy. They knew Tabitha wasn't just a survivor. She was the only living witness, and there was a real fear that whoever committed the murders might try to silence her. Nicole did everything she could to help the investigation. Despite her grief, she answered every question, recounted memories of her family, and shared details about anyone who might have had contact with them. Meanwhile, her husband, Chris Harris, appeared to be her main source of comfort. He spent long hours beside her, helping her talk to detectives, offering support, and staying close through the chaos. To outsiders, he seemed like a devoted husband doing everything possible to hold his wife together. But beneath that picture of support, their marriage wasn't perfect. In truth, Chris and Nicole had been through years of ups and downs. They had separated several times and had only gotten back together earlier that same year in 2009. Friends described their relationship as complicated, full of love, but also arguments and emotional strain. Still, Nicole clung to him for strength during the darkest days of her life. Days went by, and police were running out of leads. They had the shoe print, the mysterious silver pickup truck, and a few scattered tips, but nothing solid. The G family had no known enemies, no debts, and no history of conflict. By all accounts, they were the kind of neighbors everyone loved, generous, hardworking, and family-oriented. Nobody could imagine who would want to hurt them. Out of caution, authorities warned the entire community to stay alert, lock their doors, and report anything suspicious. Fear spread quickly through Beason, a town that once felt safe, now seemed haunted by what had happened. Porch lights stayed on late into the night, and even close neighbors began to look at each other differently. The people of Beason knew one horrifying truth. If a family as kind as the G's could be wiped out in their sleep, no one was truly safe.
People just need to take the normal precautions that you would take, the practical measures of at night, lock your door, know where your children are at, and keep track of your neighbors. That's a good thing to do.
A week later, on the 28th of that same month, the small town of Beason came together to say goodbye to the G family. The funeral was devastating. Hundreds showed up, many holding hands, crying quietly, still unable to process what had happened. Meanwhile, little Tabitha was still in the hospital, clinging to life. Her fight for survival gave the community a small glimmer of hope, but that hope was shadowed by fear. The killer was still out there, and nobody knew if or when they might strike again. Then, almost by chance, a major breakthrough came, and it happened right at the hospital. One of the officers assigned to guard Tabitha had just finished his shift. As he stepped into the elevator, he found himself riding with none other than Chris Harris, who had just come from visiting Tabitha. It was nothing unusual at first, until the officer glanced down and noticed Chris's shoes. They were K-Swiss sneakers with the same aggressive tread pattern as the bloody shoe print found outside the G family's home. That tiny detail set off alarm bells. The officer immediately reported what he saw to investigators, and soon after, Chris was called in for questioning. Detectives took his shoes for comparison, and while the tread design matched perfectly, the size didn't. Chris's shoes were a half size larger than the print found at the scene. Still, something about the situation didn't sit right with the investigators. They had a feeling this wasn't just coincidence. To dig deeper, police collected Chris's fingerprints and palm prints and sent them to the state crime lab for testing. As news of the investigation spread, Chris's younger brother, Jason Harris, stepped forward to defend him. Jason claimed that Chris couldn't have been involved because the two of them were together that night, miles away from Beason. He insisted that Chris was innocent and said the police were making a mistake. Nicole, meanwhile, was furious when she found out her husband was being treated as a suspect. She went online to defend him, writing an emotional message on her MySpace page. It read, with her usual typos and raw pain, "This whole situation is such a mess and so unfair. Not only have my children lost 5 close family members, but now their daddy is being set up and taken away. This is too much to bear." She continued, "There's solid evidence that all 6 victims fought for their lives, and Chris doesn't even have a scratch on him. He's been with us through everything, and now they've taken him too." Nicole wasn't alone in standing by him. Chris's stepmother, Debbie Harris, spoke publicly to the media, saying their family had complete faith in his innocence. His father, Ed Harris, was devastated. In a phone call from jail, Ed broke down crying as Chris told him, "Dad, I'm scared because I know the killers are still out there." He swore he hadn't done it. When police officially booked Christopher Harris, they photographed every inch of his body, searching for any sign of struggle. He didn't have bruises or cuts that would match a violent fight. But detectives did notice one curious detail: a large blister on the palm of his right hand. It looked fresh, the kind that could have come from gripping something hard, like a weapon. Not long after, investigators discovered a tire iron near a creek close to Jason Harris's house. They were still combing the area for clues, and this find immediately raised red flags. Around the same time, detectives seized the truck Chris had been driving, only to learn that it didn't even belong to him. It was registered to Jennifer Ernest, Jason's girlfriend and the mother of his children. Both Jennifer and her mother, Sarah Duncan, had provided airtight alibis for the Harris brothers, swearing that Chris and Jason were with them the night of the murders. But as the investigation deepened, inconsistencies began to surface. Phone records, witness statements, and timelines didn't add up. Before long, police proved the alibis were false, and both women were arrested for obstruction of justice. The turning point came when investigators confirmed that one of the bloody palm prints at the G house matched Chris Harris. That was the first solid physical link tying him directly to the crime scene. Around the same time, a local woman named Lori Cole, who worked as an armed security guard, came forward with new information. She told investigators that around 11:35 p.m. on the night of the murders, Chris and his brother Jason had knocked on her door, asking if she wanted to party. Lori lived not far from the G family. She said she turned them down, explaining she had work early the next morning. But something about their behavior felt off. They were hyper, jittery, clearly under the influence, and didn't seem ready to call it a night. She noticed they were driving a Ford Ranger pickup truck, just like the one witnesses had spotted near the G property around the time of the killings. Another woman, Christy Moore, came forward shortly after. She told police that she and Chris had been in an on-and-off affair for a while. According to Christy, Chris called her late that same Sunday night, the night the murders happened, but she couldn't meet him because her kids were still awake. They agreed instead to meet the next morning after she dropped her children off at school. True to his word, Chris showed up at her house in Clinton, just 15 minutes from Beason, roughly 12 hours after the murders. Christy said he acted completely normal. They ended up sleeping together, and afterward she even took selfies of them in bed, photos that showed them smiling, kissing, and goofing around. She told detectives that Chris had no scratches, bruises, or injuries at all. He looked calm, relaxed, like nothing was wrong. The only thing she found unusual was how suddenly he'd popped back into her life. She hadn't seen him in about 2 months, which happened to line up with the birth of his second baby with Nicole. From the moment Chris was accused, he denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with the G family's deaths. But when detectives presented him with the fingerprint evidence, he clammed up, invoked his Fifth Amendment right, and demanded a lawyer. For a while, it seemed like he was ready to ride it out and let the legal process handle things. But then the pressure shifted, directly onto his brother, Jason. Jason's obstruction charge quickly escalated. Soon, he was facing the same as Chris: 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Facing life in prison, Jason had to make a choice: protect his brother or save himself. In the end, survival won. He started talking, and what he said was chilling. According to Jason, that night began like many others, with drugs and booze. The brothers had been out drinking and snorting cocaine, bouncing between friends' houses and looking for something or someone to keep the night going. They first tried contacting a few women they knew, including ex-girlfriends, but both turned them down. That rejection didn't stop them. High and restless, they kept driving around, desperate for company, a decision that would lead straight to the G family's doorstep. Jason told investigators they first went to Lori Cole's house, where Chris tried to get her to party. When she refused, Jason said Chris got frustrated and aggressive. What happened after that changed depending on which version Jason told, and he gave 13 in total. But one thing remained the same. He said Chris was the killer. Jason claimed that Chris came up with the idea to go to the G house. According to him, Chris was obsessed with 16-year-old Justina G, his sister-in-law, and believed she had been flirting with him. Jason said Chris wanted to confront her, possibly even sleep with her, though it was unclear if he thought it would be consensual. In one version of Jason's story, Chris brought the tire iron with him. In another, he grabbed it from the truck after an argument broke out with Rick G at the front door. Jason said he stayed outside in the truck while his brother went inside, and then the sounds began. He told investigators he could hear banging, shouting, and thumping, the sounds of chaos. Then he saw 14-year-old Dylan leap out of a bedroom window, bleeding and panicked. The boy ran toward the front door, only for Chris to chase after him. Jason said he saw Chris hit Dylan 5 or 6 times with the tire iron before heading back inside the house. Moments later, Chris returned to the truck, calm and cold, like nothing had happened. As they drove away down the dirt road, Jason said Chris rolled down his window and tossed out his bloodied shoes and the tire iron. Investigators later retraced their route exactly as Jason described, and sure enough, they found both the K-Swiss shoes and the tire iron in a roadside ditch. DNA testing confirmed the horrifying truth. Both items contained the blood of multiple G family members, along with traces of Christopher Harris's own DNA. And with that discovery, the story that once seemed impossible, that Nicole's husband might have murdered her entire family, suddenly became undeniable. On May 31, 2013, justice finally caught up with Christopher Harris. After years of investigation, a jury found him guilty of murdering the G family. The sentencing took place on July 19th, and the verdict was as heavy as the crime itself: 5 consecutive life sentences for the murders, plus 30 years for the attempted murder of Tabitha, another 30 years for home invasion, and 20 more for robbery. During the trial, Harris's defense team tried to spin an unbelievable story. They claimed he had simply walked in on Dylan G committing the murders and that he killed Dylan in self-defense. But that argument collapsed instantly under the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Before sentencing, Chris and his attorneys tried to push for a retrial, but the judge denied it. Years later, in 2019, they appealed to the Appellate Court of Illinois, 4th District, and that too was denied. But the case didn't fade away quietly. Not long after his conviction, a former cellmate came forward with a disturbing confession Chris had allegedly shared behind bars, a version of the story even darker than what Jason had told. According to the cellmate, Chris said that when he arrived at the G home that night, Rick G answered the door. An argument broke out, and things turned violent when Chris struck Rick with the tire iron. Ruth, hearing the noise, rushed in to help, but Chris turned on her too, beating her mercilessly. Dylan, in a desperate attempt to protect his mother, grabbed a kitchen knife and tried to fight back, but he was no match for Chris's strength. It was during this struggle, the cellmate said, that Dylan jumped, or was thrown, through the window, which matched what Jason had described seeing that night. Even more chilling, the cellmate claimed Chris showed no remorse whatsoever. He said Chris had told him his only regret was not burning down the house to destroy the evidence, bragging that if he had, no one would have ever known it was me. As for Nicole, the truth shattered her. The woman who had once defended her husband so fiercely turned against him completely once the evidence became undeniable. During sentencing, Tabitha, now 7 years old, delivered a heart-wrenching statement that silenced the entire courtroom. Through tears, she said, "I am 7, and it still breaks my heart. I wish you were dead, and my brothers, sister, and mommy and daddy were alive. You don't sneak up on other people. You have to say sorry, because do you know how badly that broke my heart?" It was a moment that left everyone in the room, even seasoned detectives, in tears. Jason Harris, who had testified against his brother, received a 10-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation, with credit for time served. The decision drew mixed reactions. Many felt it wasn't fair, that Jason had heard Dylan screaming for help that night and still did nothing. He had every chance to stop his brother, but instead, he stayed silent. Yet without his testimony, the prosecution may never have been able to secure a conviction. Jason's girlfriend, Jennifer Ernest, and her mother, Sarah Duncan, also faced justice. They were sentenced to probation and fines for lying to police and hiding evidence. Meanwhile, little Tabitha, the only survivor, slowly began to recover. During her hospital stay, the state troopers who guarded her formed a special bond with her. They painted her toenails, read her bedtime stories, played games, and even threw her a birthday party. Despite enduring multiple surgeries, Tabitha amazed doctors with her recovery. Miraculously, her brain injuries left her unable to remember the attack, a painful blessing in disguise that spared her from reliving the trauma. After her recovery, Tabitha spent time in foster care before finally being reunited with her sister Nicole. Together, they built a new life away from Beason. The community, still shaken by the tragedy, later dedicated a playground in memory of Austin, Dylan, and Justina G. A place filled with laughter, light, and the spirit of the siblings who once played together on that quiet Illinois land. In 2014, the TV show When Murder Comes to Town aired an episode about the G family murders. But the way it told the story stirred outrage. The show leaned toward the defense's narrative, portraying Dylan as a troubled boy capable of violence, a claim that deeply upset investigators and those who knew the family. In response, several officers who had worked the case wrote an open letter criticizing the show's accuracy, reminding viewers that Dylan wasn't a villain. He was a hero who fought to protect his family in their final moments. And honestly, they were right. Dylan's bravery deserves to be remembered, not rewritten. So what do you think? Was justice truly served? Did Jason deserve a lighter sentence, or should he have faced the same punishment as his brother? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As you can tell, the G family's story is absolutely heartbreaking, but we're not done yet. In another tragic twist, our next case takes us to a different family massacre, one just as haunting: the Carnation Murders.
Christmas is supposed to be the most magical and joyful time of the year, but for the Anderson family, it became the most awful massacre the tiny town of Carnation, Washington, has ever seen.
911?
There's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now.
Inside?
I just came up. She works with me.
Inside the house?
Yes.
What do you see?
There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
On December 26, 2007, Linda Thielu, worried when her best friend Judy Anderson didn't show up for work, went to check on her and made a horrifying discovery. Judy, her husband, their son and his wife, and even their 2 young children, just 5 and 3 years old, had all been brutally murdered. This peaceful town of barely 2,000 people had never seen anything so terrifying. What made the tragedy even stranger was that the only member of the family left alive was Michelle Anderson, Judy's daughter, who was living nearby with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe.
I'm sorry, I did because I thought I had to. And yeah, I know that's not a very good excuse, but I'm not trying to excuse myself. I'm just trying to explain my actions. I'm sorry. I'm terrible.
The Anderson family, by all accounts, didn't have any known enemies. They were loved and well respected in the community, which made the whole thing even more confusing. When news of the murders broke, people in town were genuinely shocked and heartbroken, wondering who could have done something so brutal and, more importantly, why.
Seeing everybody die, remembering what I did, how worthless as it is, how worthless I am because I killed all these people. They deserve to die. They deserve to live a lot more than I did, but they don't.
To even begin to understand how all of this happened, we have to first talk about the people at the center of it all, the Anderson family. This wasn't just any family. In a small, close-knit town like Carnation, Washington, everyone kind of knows everyone. Lives are often deeply intertwined, so when something this horrifying happens, it hits differently. Based on what witnesses and neighbors have said, the Andersons seemed like your average family, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, the father, held a solid, well-paying job as an engineer at Boeing. His wife, 61-year-old Judy, was a familiar face in town thanks to her job at the local post office, where she became close friends with a woman named Linda. Yes, the same Linda who later made the 911 call that brought this entire case to light. Linda wasn't just close to Judy either. She seemed to be on good terms with the entire family. Wayne and Judy had 2 children, 32-year-old Scott and 29-year-old Michelle. Now, most parents wouldn't say they had a favorite child, not out loud anyway, but people who knew the family say it seemed pretty obvious that Scott was the golden child. Whether it was because Michelle struggled more or simply because Scott made safer choices, it's hard to say. But the tension was definitely there. Michelle always seemed to be the black sheep. While Scott was building a stable life, marrying a woman named Erica, having 2 young kids, Olivia and Nathan, who were just 5 and 3 years old, Michelle's life looked very different. She still lived on her parents' property, in a small trailer about 200 yards away from the main house. She didn't pay rent, worked a basic job at Target, and had a boyfriend named Joseph McEnroe, who, frankly, many considered a deadbeat. He was unemployed, directionless, and, according to some accounts, a bad influence. To make matters worse, it appeared Michelle might have been harboring deep resentment. Her brother had everything: a loving wife, 2 beautiful kids, a stable job, and the full support of their parents. Erica, Scott's wife, was also very close to Wayne and Judy. Some even believed they treated Erica more like a daughter than Michelle herself. That kind of dynamic, whether spoken or not, can eat away at someone who already feels like an outsider in their own family. On the other hand, Joseph McEnroe came from Santa Clara, California, and while he didn't grow up in Carnation like Michelle did, the two had a lot in common. His relatives described him as someone who tried hard to be liked. A quiet guy who loved video games and mostly kept to himself. He wasn't known to be aggressive or mean-spirited. In fact, people remembered him as more of a loner than anything else. But like Michelle, Joseph seemed to drift through life without a solid plan. He didn't have a stable job, no clear direction, and just seemed stuck. Still, even with all those challenges, no one expected his name to ever be connected to anything violent or tragic. Digging a little deeper, though, Joseph's life wasn't as calm as it looked. He struggled with intense anxiety and often found it hard to navigate everyday situations. One thing that really stood out about him was how easily influenced he could be. He sometimes had trouble telling right from wrong, especially in stressful moments. That kind of vulnerability made him a bit of a follower, someone who could be pulled in directions he might not have gone on his own. His relationship with Michelle started in 2001 after they met through a dating app, and it quickly became one of those intense, clingy partnerships that didn't seem all that healthy. The two leaned heavily on each other, but instead of lifting one another up, it was more like they were dragging each other down. They lived together in a trailer just a couple hundred yards from Michelle's parents' home, rent-free but far from comfortable. The place was in poor condition, and with no stable income between them, they were constantly struggling to make ends meet. Joseph didn't have many friends around, and the two of them rarely seemed to interact much with the rest of the town. Now, as mentioned earlier, Joseph McEnroe didn't have the best work ethic. He rarely made the effort to find a job, and when he did manage to get one, it usually didn't last very long. Stability was practically non-existent in his life with Michelle. Meanwhile, Michelle couldn't help but compare their situation to that of her parents, Wayne and Judy Anderson, who were both doing just fine financially. But instead of feeling supported or proud, Michelle felt overlooked, like her parents were intentionally keeping her at arm's length. She believed they weren't doing enough to help her, especially considering they'd brought her into the world. That's how she saw it anyway. Eventually, after letting her and Joseph live rent-free on their property for years, her parents decided it was time to start charging rent. And Michelle didn't take that well. She felt like they were turning their backs on her, and to make matters worse, she also claimed that her brother Scott had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from her over the years, around $40,000, she said, and had never made any real effort to pay her back. Now, despite all these hardships, Michelle and Joseph were surprisingly the ride-or-die type. They were totally committed to each other, always sticking together no matter how rough life got. They even dreamed of running off to Las Vegas to get married someday. But first, they felt like they had some unfinished business to settle with Michelle's parents, Wayne and Judy. It turned out Joseph had quietly bought 2 guns back in the summer of 2006, a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Those weapons were no joke. Then on Christmas Eve of 2007, instead of joining the family celebration, Michelle and Joseph showed up at Wayne and Judy's house with a deadly plan. Judy was in the back room, carefully wrapping presents for her grandkids, trying to keep the holiday spirit alive, while Wayne was somewhere else in the house, getting things ready. But behind that peaceful scene, chaos was creeping in. Joseph kept a gun hidden in his waistband to distract Judy with small talk, while Michelle moved quietly toward her dad with her own gun drawn. She aimed and tried to pull the trigger, but her gun jammed. Panic set in. Joseph quickly rushed in and fired a shot that ended Wayne's life instantly. Hearing the gunfire, Judy ran into the room, only to be met with bullets from Joseph. She fell screaming, and in a chilling moment, Joseph apologized before putting the gun to her head and pulling the trigger. With both parents now dead, Michelle and Joseph must have realized just how badly their plan had gone wrong, but there was no turning back. They knew Scott, Erica, and the kids would arrive any minute, so they scrambled to clean up the mess. They dragged the bodies to a nearby storage shed and frantically tried to wipe away the blood with towels and chemicals, hoping to erase the horror that had just unfolded in that quiet little house. Now Michelle and Joseph did manage to make the place spotless, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. About 45 minutes after Wayne and Judy were gunned down, Scott arrived at the house with his wife Erica and their kids. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Michelle waiting for him. Things went sideways fast when she pulled out her gun and charged at him. In a desperate attempt to save his family, Scott rushed toward her, but Michelle fired 4 shots straight at him. One of those bullets pierced his neck, and just like that, his life was over. Erica was hit twice in the barrage of bullets, but somehow she held on. She knew she had to do something, anything, to stop the nightmare from getting worse. That's when she spotted a cordless phone nearby. Bleeding and barely able to move, Erica crawled over to the sofa for cover, grabbed the phone, and called for help. She managed to stay on the line only a few seconds before Joseph showed up and snatched the phone away. The operator heard only muffled voices and some yelling, and because she couldn't get clear info, she thought maybe it was just a noisy party getting out of hand. Still, she sent 2 officers to check things out.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Meanwhile, Joseph ripped the phone apart, yanking out the batteries and crushing it under his feet. Later, he admitted that Erica had been begging him the whole time, even screaming at him not to hurt the kids. All he could do was apologize again and again, but those apologies didn't stop him from finishing what he started. Joseph fired a bullet straight into Erica's head, coldly ending the second generation of the Anderson family, leaving only Michelle alive. But the horror didn't stop there. There was still the youngest generation to deal with. 2 little kids, just 5 and 3 years old. You'd think after all the violence these 2 wouldn't be harmed, but that wasn't the case. Michelle looked at her niece and nephew and instantly saw them as a threat, liabilities that couldn't be allowed to live. She became terrified that if they survived, they could become witnesses in any future trial. The thought of them talking, of secrets slipping out, made her paranoid. So she decided they had to be silenced. But there was one problem. Michelle just couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. The thought of harming children was too much even for her. So she turned to Joseph, who must have been horrified at the suggestion. But deep down, even he knew the brutal truth behind her words. Together they started rationalizing the unthinkable. They told themselves that the children would be scarred for life by what they had already witnessed, that their innocence was shattered beyond repair, and maybe in some twisted way it was kinder to put them out of their misery quickly than to let them suffer forever. It's chilling to think about how they managed to convince themselves of such a thing. Joseph went first, taking Olivia's life with a whispered apology. The little girl's eyes didn't even have time to understand what was happening before the bullet ended her. Then there was 3-year-old Nathan, sitting on the floor, completely unaware or maybe painfully aware of the chaos around him. Nathan was playing quietly with the crushed batteries from the cordless phone, innocent and fragile. Joseph later said something haunting about this moment. Nathan looked up at him with full understanding, like the child somehow knew exactly what was about to happen.
If I thought that holding myself or killing myself or doing anything, that anything I could do would go off and bring back these people or ameliorate the pain or something, I would.
And with that cold detachment, Joseph pulled the trigger once more, ending Nathan's life just like his grandparents, parents, and sister. The deed was done, but then Michelle realized something terrifying. Erica's 911 call had actually gone through. The line was brief, but it was enough for emergency services to be alerted. Panic set in as Michelle understood that the police would be arriving any minute now to investigate what had just happened. So quick as she could, she ran out to the dirt road that led up to the house and locked the front gate behind her, hoping to delay or deter any immediate entry. Just moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up, responding to the 911 call. They approached the locked gate and found it shut tight. No easy way in. They listened carefully, but didn't hear any sounds of a disturbance. No yelling, no crying, nothing that would scream that something was terribly wrong. They even checked with a neighbor nearby, who said they hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Without any more leads or evidence, the deputies decided to leave the scene without digging deeper. That brief, quiet moment gave Michelle and Joseph the small window they needed. But deep down, both of them knew they had crossed the point of no return. They were the sole survivors of a brutal massacre that claimed 6 lives, a horrific act that would forever stain their lives. And despite living just a couple of 100 yards from the crime scene, the police quickly identified Michelle and Joseph as persons of interest. It wasn't a matter of if they'd be suspected, it was when. The investigators would interview them again and again, slowly unraveling the story, and eventually the truth would become impossible to hide. Whether it was out of clear-headed calculation or just desperate panic, Michelle and Joseph didn't stick around to face the music. They fled, making a run for the Canadian border in hopes of disappearing. But somewhere along the way, they realized that escaping north might not be their best bet after all. Instead, they turned west and headed to Oregon, choosing a different path in hopes of shaking the law off their trail. This meant they had to pass right by Wayne and Judy's property, the very scene of their crime. It's chilling to imagine whether they took a moment to look back, to see the aftermath of what they'd done. Back in Carnation, on December 26th, 2 days after the murder, Linda Thiele, Judy's best friend, started to worry when Judy didn't show up at the post office like she always did. It was totally out of character for Judy, who was punctual and rarely took sick days. Concerned, Linda went over to Judy's house to check on her. Peering through the window, she was met with a sight no one should ever have to see. 2 lifeless bodies lying on the floor. That moment marked the beginning of a nightmare for the whole community, as the horrifying truth of that Christmas Eve massacre slowly came to light. The first 2 bodies she saw were those of Scott and Erica, but in her shock and confusion, she initially thought they were Wayne and Judy. Her mind struggled to make sense of the horror in front of her. At that moment, Linda had no clue that every person inside that house had been shot, executed in cold blood. Instead, her first assumption, as strange as it may sound now, was that maybe it had been some kind of tragic accident. Carbon monoxide poisoning, she thought. That would at least make some sense. But once she stepped through the doorway and into the house, the truth hit her like a freight train. The signs of violence were everywhere. Gunshots, blood, the unmistakable scent of death. And any illusion of an accident vanished. Completely distraught, shaking, and barely able to process what she was seeing, Linda called the police. Her voice trembled as she described what she'd just found.
There's 3 people dead that I can see right now. I just came up, she works with me. There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend. This is locked, which makes me wonder if her daughter did it. Which is scary, because then I might be up here with a murderer.
The police swarmed in fast, setting up a perimeter around the house. Yellow tape was stretched across the property, and investigators began carefully documenting the grisly scene, while stunned neighbors looked on in shock. And right at that exact moment, almost like some twisted twist of fate, Michelle and Joseph happened to drive by. As mentioned earlier, they initially planned to flee to Canada, but changed course and were headed to Oregon. Still, something made them stop. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at their conscience, or maybe they just wanted to see what kind of chaos they'd left behind. Whatever the reason, they pulled over, stepped out of the car, and were quickly approached by police. It didn't take long before officers became suspicious. Michelle and Joseph were too close to the scene, too calm, and their timing was just too perfect. They were brought in for questioning, and from there, everything started to fall apart. At first, the couple tried to lie their way out of it. They spun a ridiculous story, saying they were heading to Las Vegas to get married, but it was flimsy, and they both knew it. The weight of what they'd done was crushing them. The pressure finally broke Michelle first. She collapsed in tears during interrogation and confessed. She sobbed through the confession, struggling to speak but wanting to get it all out. Meanwhile, Joseph stayed quiet. He insisted he was innocent, but that didn't save either of them. Both Michelle and Joseph were formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree homicide for the deaths of Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, and the 2 little children, Olivia and Nathan. The initial investigation proceeded rapidly, but the actual trial would not begin until almost 3 years later. This delay was due in large part to pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and the complexity of the evidence that had to be carefully analyzed and verified. The trial officially kicked off in the summer of 2008, when both defendants were formally arraigned and prosecutors laid out the horrific details of the case. During these early court proceedings, Michelle initially denied full involvement, but the mounting pressure, combined with the overwhelming evidence, ranging from forensic reports to phone records and chilling witness testimonies, eventually led her to a dramatic confession. It was in late 2008, several months into the trial, that Michelle broke down in tears on the witness stand and admitted she was the mastermind behind the massacre. Meanwhile, Joseph McEnroe maintained his claim that Michelle was the controlling force behind the murders, portraying himself as someone manipulated into complicity. However, prosecutors methodically dismantled this defense over the course of the trial, presenting evidence that showed Joseph was an active participant. Despite his claims, the jury was persuaded by the prosecution's argument that both Michelle and Joseph shared responsibility for the horrific acts. The community followed every twist with heavy hearts and growing impatience as the trial stretched on month after month. By early 2009, the prosecution was pushing hard for the death penalty. The 6 counts of first-degree homicide carried the possibility of the harshest punishment available under Washington state law. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold-blooded killers who had shown no remorse and had carried out a meticulously planned and savage attack on their own family members, including 2 young children. Public opinion was largely in favor of the death penalty, reflecting the anger and grief felt by many in the community. Yet, on January 31st, 2013, after years of hearings, the presiding Judge Jeffrey announced a surprising decision. The death penalty was off the table for both defendants. Citing evidentiary and procedural considerations, the judge ruled that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be the maximum sentence. While many expected capital punishment for such a brutal crime, the law required careful adherence to rules ensuring fairness and due process. The lengthy wait for a resolution had frustrated some, but it underscored the complexities of administering justice in the most serious cases. Realizing that the death penalty was no longer a looming threat, but that life imprisonment was inevitable, Joseph McEnroe changed his strategy. In the months following the judge's decision, he pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of first-degree homicide, which was a move intended to avoid any further legal battles that might have prolonged the process. In his plea, McEnroe reiterated his earlier defense that Michelle had dominated their relationship and influenced his actions, but the court was unswayed. His courtroom demeanor and the overwhelming evidence sealed his fate. Michelle Anderson, on her part, accepted full responsibility, showing deep remorse and calling herself a monster during the sentencing phase. She expressed sincere regret for the pain she caused, acknowledging the unimaginable devastation she inflicted on the family and community. Despite her pleas, the judge made it clear that the law demanded a strict sentence for such heinous crimes. Finally, in mid-2013, after nearly 8 years of legal proceedings since the murders, both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the gravity of their crimes and the need for society's protection from such violent offenders.
Ms. Anderson, the result is pretty much preordained. Ms. Anderson, pursuant to your convictions, the law mandates that I impose 6 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of release or parole, plus a sentence of enhancement of 60 months on each count as well. I will impose the mandatory victims assessment penalty, the DNA fee. Restitution will be set at a separate proceeding, which you may waive your presence at if you so desire. I will waive all other non-mandatory fees and assessments, and that will be the order of the court.
But no matter how much justice has finally been served, the horrific memories of that terrible night still haunt everyone involved. What's truly heartbreaking is that there's no one left to mourn the Anderson family anymore, except for the very people who took their lives and a handful of close friends who managed to survive the nightmare. One of those friends, Linda, had to relive the trauma again and again throughout the entire trial, forced to revisit the worst day of her life in vivid detail while testifying, making sure the pain stayed etched into her memory forever. The small town of Carnation hasn't been the same since that awful Christmas Eve. To this day, you can bet that locals still whisper about the horrors that happened in that big house just up the road. The mobile home and the storage shed where it all unfolded still stand, silent witnesses to a nightmare that changed the community forever. It's like a shadow hanging over the place, a dark chapter that no one really wants to talk about but can't forget. So what do you think about this case? Do you believe Michelle and Joseph deserved the death penalty for what they did? Or is life without parole the right kind of punishment for such monstrous actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.